Senior Procurement Specialist working at TLT. I have over 20 years of experience working in the sector. Initially, I worked in the construction industry for many years as both as QS and a buyer. And then following that, I worked in the public sector for a number of years as a head of procurement. And in the last 3 years, I've moved over to TLT, specializing in the more legal side of technical procurement. And today we're going to talk through understanding the procedures under the new Act. So in this session, we are going to cover what are the new procedures, what are conditions of tendering, what are the rules around engaging with suppliers during the procedure, and what are the rules around negotiating after selecting a supplier, and something particularly pertinent to construction, what are staged awards and when might they be used? So currently under the legislation, we have a number of different procedures that are prescriptively set out in the PCRs. We have an open, we have a restricted, which is the 2-stage with a separate SQ. We have competitive procedure with negotiation that allows us some level of negotiation with the suppliers. And we have competitive dialogue. As of the 28th of October, this is going to change. And under the Act, we will have just 2 procedures, one of which is the open and looks very much similar to what we've got now. And the other is a competitive flexible procedure. And the joy of this one is it's going to allow authorities to make their own procedures, including potentially recreating a restricted or a competitive procedure with negotiation. Within the competitive flexible procedure, local authorities will be able to look and use at different options when they're designing their procedure. So on this slide, I've set out a variety of the different activities, as I like to call them, that suppliers might be asked to engage in during a procedure. Now, each of these different activities have different time constraints on them, and they have different sequencing constraints. So it's really worth noting that, for example, market engagement should be done before you initiate. A tender notice is what's done to actually launch a procedure. At the same time as launching that, they would submit to you a set of initial and updated documents. Then throughout the procedure, depending on how they've designed it, they will be able to exclude suppliers. At some point in the procedure, and it doesn't have to be at the beginning, they may look to set conditions of participation. Equally, they might include the ability to refine the award criteria. And there are really quite strict rules on this, so it's worth sort of watching out. If they are going to refine it, check exactly at what point they're going to do that. If it's an open procedure, then obviously we'd only have one tender, but actually under the competitive flexible procedure, we could go straight into a tender before we then go into any sort of limiting suppliers. And then interaction rounds, which we'll look at in a bit more detail, can take a variety of stances. Likewise, they can refine the procedure, but again, they will need to tell you exactly when and how. And there can be intermediate tender and final tenders, so that you as a supplier can update your bid following some form of interaction with the authority. And then, of course, once we get to the end, in all of the cases, there must be a contract award, assuming they don't decide to terminate the procurement, which they can. So thinking of those different procedures, I've tried to map out here a flowchart of what that might look like. Now, obviously, an open procedure is a nice, simple flowchart. We commence the procedure, we send out our notice, requesting a tender. Then we do everything at once: the conditions of participation, exclusion, conditions of tendering, technical and commercial requirements. It's all done in one go. We evaluate and we conclude. Now, if you look at that in comparison to the competitive flexible procedure, you will see in this case, we can use that initial notice either to be a call for participation, where we'd ask suppliers to complete conditions of participation, or we could go straight into the equivalent of an open tender and not actually seek to limit suppliers on condition of participation grounds. You would then go through to assessing those tenders, and then you can go through this little cycle that I've got at the bottom. So after that evaluation, you could interact with them, or you could go on and you could limit them, then interact with them. You could then invite tenders again, evaluate, and you could go round and round a number of times, depending on how it's been designed for the authority. What's important to note, though, is in designing this process, they must ensure that it is proportionate to the complexity and value of the contract. So would not expect to see multiple iterations going around tenders on a contract value that is literally just above the 5.37 million. So if you do see a procedure that looks really arduous in the procurement documents, do feel free to ask the authority the reason for those additional iterations. And it will also be really important that they explain in the documents what it is and why they're doing it. So looking at the documents, within all instruction documents, you will see some form of information around conditions of tendering. And it's important to note here that it's called conditions of tendering because it's a sort of contract. If you're choosing to participate in the tender process, then you are agreeing to do so on the bounds of this document. Now, because we can no longer say things like we are procuring a restricted procedure in line with Regulation 28, it's going to be really important that you read the document and you look at the what, when, why, and how they're going to do things. What are the rules around getting involved and participating? How are they going to deal with information sharing? What's the process around clarifications? How are they going to manage conflict of interests? And what do you need to do to actually comply in the procedure? Because under the Act now, improper behaviour could get you excluded. In addition to these sort of basic rules, they'll probably include things on format, size, timescales, etc. So that's all really important. And they will have included a step-by-step detail of the process. This could be a flowchart or a table. Now, one of the most interesting points when we're looking at the Act is that in the way they've designed the procedures, there is no longer this clear sort of option for procurement with dialogue or negotiations. And if you actually go looking through the Act, it's not really set out anywhere that says you can do this or that. That said, there is some central government guidance that does talk authorities, and probably is useful to suppliers too, through the options of how they might engage with suppliers during a procurement procedure. There is still the option to have dialogue, and that's a conversation about the procurement as a whole and the aims of a whole. We can have negotiation, so that's discussions with a supplier with the aim of improving their bids. We can have demonstrations, so if you're proposing a particular product or some particular software, the authority can include demonstrations to check that the process or the software is suitable. There could be presentations by either side. They might like to arrange site visits. That could be visiting your sites or you visiting one of theirs. They will likely include a section on clarifications. So the commonly relied on Reg 56.4 that sets out clarifications. There is nothing exactly worded like this in the Act. And so it's really important that they set this out in the procurement documents and you understand how you can engage through clarifications. You will get feedback, most likely, on intermediate rounds. And then following any of these engagement activities, it is highly likely that the authority will update the procurement documents to incorporate that learning. So these are all different ways that we can engage. And it is important to note that this is only in the competitive flexible procedure. If you're looking to do an open procedure, then the authority will not be able to do any of these other than conduct clarification questions. So we've looked at negotiation during the procedure, but what about negotiating after we've picked a preferred supplier? Now, there's nothing in the Act that expressly says you can or you can't. So we'll take silence as consent that we can. And as with the other types of engagement, if you look at the guidance that central government has published, there is a section that talks about what you can do. So if the authority wants to have some form of negotiation post selecting a preferred supplier, this must be very clearly set out in the tender notice and the associated tender documents. So if they don't put it there, they cannot do it. And they also need to make sure that this negotiation will not materially change the submitted tender. So the sorts of things that you might find they want to do is if you put forward a particular product or a supply chain member, you might want to look at that. They might want to finesse reporting or meetings. They might save setting KPIs for when they've identified a preferred supplier, particularly where that's going to be contractualized. They might want to discuss social value and the practical side of actually delivering it. And then depending on the nature, if it's a really complicated construction program, they might want to finesse some of those timescales and think about how design and practical come together. That next thing to consider is how will they include in there dealing with things like design contracts, enabling works contracts. Maybe it's a phased project, 1, 2 different phases. Now, it's always been a difficult subject in construction, in public procurement, because this is really normal to us in construction, but this doesn't sit perhaps as neatly as it could do under the current legislation. Now, I think the flexibility that we're being given with the competitive flex procedure actually really opens us up to doing this more transparently and making sure it's really clear throughout the procurement. And there are a number of ways in which this might be possible. It may be that they factor into the procurement that they award each of these stages as a modification to the initial contract, or it may be in the way they've designed the procurement that they've scoped out in the initial tender notice that we're going to have these 4 different contracts, and each one is then awarded as a new contract under a direct award principle. Now, an important thing when you're looking at this in procurement documents is that there is an obligation that if you're using the direct award new contract form, it has to be within 5 years of the initial tender notice being published. So if the project is phased over a really long period of time, it may be rather than the direct award, you're looking to check they've got it as modifications. But do look through the documents and make sure you understand exactly how they're going to manage these different phases. And then finally, so just for your satisfaction, as you're going through the procurement documents, you'll find, or you should find, hopefully, that various stages throughout the document, there is some reference to how this is going to work. So we'd like to see it very clearly set out in the tender notice that there is going to be a staged award. They may even have mentioned it in market engagement. And when they're scoping and costing up the contract as part of the planning, they need to have thought about the whole life of the contract. And you need to be able to pull that out really clearly when you're looking at the documents. Once we move into the procurement phase, it should be very clear in the ITT. There needs to be an express function in the contract, either to award as a new contract or to do as a modification. And there needs to be something set out in the engagement process to help discuss and understand exactly how this is going to work. Once you get to contract award, obviously we have talked about engaging and finalising the documents, but we need to make sure that this stage process is really clearly set out in the contract award notice and the details notice and in the contract that has to be published so that everybody knows that this is the intention. And then once we go into contract management, we need to make sure this part in the documents is really clear about how during the design phase, we're going to finalise the works requirements before we go into the works contract and make sure that that is really super clear. And then how either through contract modification or transparency notice, we're going to move then into each of the stages. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact myself or any of my colleagues. Our details are included on the slides. And I'm just going to take a quick opportunity to plug our new Procuring 360 offering, in which we can provide both local authorities and public sector suppliers with support in getting ready for the Act. And as you can see from this slide, we offer not just legal, but technical consultancy and practical support. And so please do check out our website to find out more about what we, the team, can provide you with, and if there is any further support that we can provide to you in preparing for the Act. Thank you.